Welcome and greetings to all participants on Zoom, YouTube, and Twitter. My name is Sadri Singh, and I'm the Chief Gender and Health at the UN University's International Institute for Global Health, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The Institute is a designated UN think tank on global health, serving as a policy translation hub for UN member states, agencies, and programs. We are delighted to be co-hosting this session with UNICEF and ARROW, the Asian Pacific Resources and Research Center for Women, on advancing gender equality in the response to climate change through transferable lessons from SRHR. As we look forward to advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the context of climate change, we have an opportunity and indeed a responsibility to learn from other areas of work, and so to build on those perspectives and avoid the pitfalls. We have an exciting agenda tonight with opening remarks by young Barbahagya Tansi Dr. Jamila Mehmood, followed by a presentation on the transferable lessons from SRHR by Dr. Malhotra, and a panel discussion of esteemed colleagues and partners, Mr. Ghoshal, Ms. Pananthiran, and Dr. Zasman, moderated by Dr. Johanna Reha, with closing remarks by Professor Pascal Hamilton. Before we begin, just to let you know, this webinar is set up as a one-way audio and video. We encourage you to add your questions and your comments in the chat box of question and answer section if you're joining from Zoom, YouTube, or Twitter. Please be sure to include your name and where you're joining us from, and we're really looking forward to an active discussion on that platform. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce young Barbahagya Tansi Dr. Jamila Mehmood, Professor and Director, Sunway Center for Planetary Health, member of the Government of Malaysia's Climate Action Council. Dr. Mehmood will be providing her opening remarks via video report.
Good evening, wherever you are. Professor Pascal Elotti, Director of UNU-IIGH, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving me the honor to say a few words at this very important meeting. Allow me first to start by painting an image, a picture. It's common knowledge that the global population now stands at 7.9 billion. That's a lot of people for sure. But if you compare humans to all of life on this planet, our 7 billion plus only makes up about 0.01% of all life on this planet. Yet, we have caused the loss of 83% of all wild mammals, wild animals, and half of that of plants. How did we get to this point? By enabling injustice after injustice to happen under the disguise of development and growth, and by turning a blind eye to the interconnectedness of climate change to all other prevalent social issues of our time. And that includes gender inequality. My humbling experiences in the humanitarian sector consistently reminds me and revealed to me that you cannot look at one crisis as a standalone. I've witnessed how prolonged droughts and food insecurity exacerbated conflicts. Women, mothers, pregnant women struggling to feed their children. I'd seen how communities were displaced after extreme weather events and catastrophic natural hazards. The pattern was glaring. Every crisis was tied inevitably to a climate crisis. So what we label as climate change is far more than that. It is a monstrous attack on the rights and freedoms of the majority of humanity by a small but very powerful minority. Whether consciously or not, its drivers are a fundamental disrespect for the rights of all, including recognizing the important fact that women's rights are human rights. Let me not get started on the gendered impact of climate change. Social cultural norms and social structures that allow for lopsided decision-making, making women more vulnerable to climate change. We saw that at the height of the pandemic. 850 million children around the world stayed at home from school, an additional burden that continues to fall primarily on women. Even before the pandemic, women were made to bear 4 times the extra burden of unpaid care work at home. At the same time, reports of domestic violence rose drastically, some resulting in unplanned pregnancies that were further complicated and neglected, especially when placed on top of poverty, and life in areas with poor hygiene, sanitation, and security just became more unbearable. These are the unseen realities behind closed doors, the shadow pandemic, invisible to the macro eyes of growth and development. Yet, there are also these are only the gendered impacts of a global pandemic. What more for the climate crisis? Therefore, we cannot talk about a sustainable climate action without acknowledging that gender equality must be a part of that solution. How then do we move forward? Starting, but not limiting to what we are doing today, building bridges and sharing learnings across sectors. This also means bolstering women's representation, be it in governance, academia, media, anywhere and everywhere. We need to see and hear more women being represented in major decision-making processes. We need sponsors and mentors and strong female role models so that feminist leadership becomes an intergenerational part of any kind of future leadership. To boil it down, we need stronger, more visible gender equal support. I will end my short keynote there, as I'm more excited to listen to what our other speakers have to share and what we will learn from each other today. I hope that these learnings of today does not end here, but instead act as a trigger for collective action. Thank you very much.
With thanks to young Barbahagya Tansri, Dr. Mahmood, for her opening remarks, it is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Anju Malhotra, a visiting fellow at UNU-IIGH, who brings over 20 years of experience in advancing gender equality and reproductive health and rights for women and girls. Dr. Malhotra served as a principal advisor gender and development at UNICEF, where she led 2 rounds of UNICEF's Gender Action Plan, focusing on the empowerment of adolescent girls through health, nutrition, menstrual dignity, and reductions in child marriage and gender-based violence. Over to you, Anju.
Thank you, Sagri. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to share lessons from work that we have been doing at IIGH on sexual and reproductive health, and figuring out what are the transferable lessons, not just for other areas of health, but for gender equality work that we need to be doing in other areas and other sectors. Next slide, please. So in the field of health, sexual and reproductive health and rights are considered perhaps the most mature gender integrated area of health. Gender equality and women's empowerment focused approaches go back 25 years and were shaped by the International Conference on Population and Development in 1994 and the Beijing Conference in 1995. And during this time, the field has evolved to encompass a spectrum of issues with challenges and opportunities to shift gender power relations, which I think is for a first lesson for the climate change movement, that the range of spaces that you have to affect grow as you start understanding the types of gender inequalities that are embedded in so many aspects related to climate change. So in sexual and reproductive health, we started with traditional issues such as family planning or maternal health, which were reframed to address reproductive health and rights, quality, and choice, and pending issues such as the adolescent sexual and reproductive health with the needs of the younger generation then got incorporated. And as emergent crises such as the HIV/AIDS crisis happened, we started to understand more of a focus on sexuality, economic control, and gender norms, and acknowledgement of social issues such as gender-based violence or child marriage, intensified multi-sectoral linkages within the sexual and reproductive health and rights movement. So the learning from this work can serve as a guide to do more of what we want to do and stop what we shouldn't be doing. And I think both are really important lessons to learn because there are a range of things that it's not a good idea to do. And understanding what does work and doesn't work has the impact that I think can transfer lessons to the climate change movement. Within our work, my colleagues and I have been looking at systematic reviews on sexual and reproductive health and rights evidence base, as well as other ways of consolidating evidence from lessons learned on programs implemented in sexual and reproductive health. Next slide. So let me start with the fundamentals. I think the first lesson is that we need to be addressing both sex differences and gender inequalities. So for example, in the sexual and reproductive health field, HIV transmission rates for men and women differ both because of sex differences and gender inequalities. And maternal health care needs are unique to women, but gender inequalities in both health systems and family care challenges affect access to quality care. And I think in climate change, you can think about, for example, implications of water shortages because for women, because they menstruate, they give birth, they have particular needs, but also because women cook, women are the ones who fetch water, and gender inequalities mean that water needs and aspects that women have to deal with are different than the ones men have to deal with. The second part of that fundamental lesson is that most gender-focused interventions end up having both positive and potentially negative consequences. And I think the reason for this is that there is whatever we do to try to address gender inequality has multidimensional consequences, and there's often pushback within the systems in ways sometimes that we should anticipate and sometimes that we don't. So for example, when we enforce or we try to establish women's right to choose family planning and have right to contraception or abortion, contraceptive use becomes a female responsibility and men abdicate responsibility, and we have to take that into account. Similarly, when we engage men in sexual and reproductive health needs and options of their female partners, then improved decision-making can result, but it can also have a negative consequence of increased violence and control over women. This doesn't mean that we don't do anything and become paralyzed because there will be negative consequences. This means that we have to keep the negative consequences in mind. So if we're working to give more economic opportunities to women, we have to keep in mind that there will be power relations, there will be sexual harassment, and we need to keep those issues in mind as well. Next slide. The second lesson is that in addressing gender inequality, it's more important to do important things rather than everything. And that, I think, makes sense because gender inequality does encompass pretty much every aspect of human social and economic and other life, and trying to do everything can paralyze one. And we have found that comprehensive programs have tended to become boutique, small scale, difficult to implement, or become hijacked in other directions because they don't have one focus behind them that can carry them through. So, for example, adolescent sexual and reproductive health the field has struggled over the last 20 years to take things to scale to really help millions of adolescents. Approaches such as comprehensive sexuality education in schools, we have tried, but we have not necessarily succeeded, and we have to find more creative options for doing these things. Similarly, broad sweep policy shifts can often mean that no money is behind those commitments. People just say that they will do very ambitious things and then don't back them up. On the other hand, we have found that more focused programs haven't yielded important successes and have built a larger, more comprehensive approach. So, for example, cash transfers and subsidies to increase skill delivery or reduce child marriage have worked, and then they give an opening to quality and choice in those fields in bigger ways. Similarly, broadening contraceptive choices and technologies to reduce unmet need have been a successful strategy in giving many, many more women in the world an access to controlling their childbearing options. Linking HIV testing to antenatal care and to increase ARV coverage for women has been a very successful strategy. These approaches have not solved all the problems in those fields, but they've been very important bedrock points. Next slide. The third lesson is that we need to change systems and services and not just women, men, and communities. Both are required. And in our field, I think the lesson that we have learned in sexual and reproductive health is that we started off by questioning that systems and services were getting too much attention, and communities and men and women were not getting enough attention. But now we need to question whether we have the balance has swung in the other direction, that we are spending a lot of time trying to empower women on decision making, trying to get them access to contraception and other things through influencing men and women in communities, or in engaging partners and families in financial and moral support, or in trying to change community norms on gender-based violence. These are good things to do, but in that process, we have often forgotten that overburdened and underpaid community health workers and male-led decision-making bodies also need to be changed, and workers need to be empowered. The system that delivers healthcare needs to be changed. Stockouts and limited innovation on essential medicines for maternal health or contraception need to be affected. So I think that we need to take lessons for the climate change efforts to not just always focus on changing women, but changing the systems that they are part of. And that doesn't just mean communities, it means the more powerful agencies, the governance system, the financial systems that are affecting their lives. Next slide, please. The fourth lesson is that we need to learn how to measure success consistently and meaningfully. So one of the lessons that we have learned in the sexual and reproductive health field is that when we have let 1,000 flowers bloom, we have not always been able to synthesize our learning because everybody's version of success is different. In our 27 systematic reviews that we looked at in sexual and reproductive health, we found more than 60 plus outcomes being measured. And that makes it difficult to add up what success looks like. There are, for example, so many indicators of women empowerment on HIV prevention or care, or on intimate partner violence-related formulated norms that it's difficult to know. For example, if a community is saying that they are willing to intervene on domestic violence, is a good enough measure of success, or should we be checking to see whether they're actually doing it? And that's just one example, but we have many measures like that we haven't set a bar for what would be at least a good satisfactory level of success. And I think for the climate change work, it would be very important to have standard measures of success that we approach the field with from the very beginning. And I think what the lesson learned in sexual and reproductive health is that when we have done that, those areas have moved forward faster. So, for example, there is a standard child marriage indicator, and it's in the SDGs because there is a standard child marriage indicator. Similarly, the intimate partner violence field has defined that there are these 4 dimensions that are critical to assess when you're looking at reductions in intimate partner violence: skilled birth delivery, unmet need for family planning. The field has worked over the years to come to an agreement on how we are going to measure success across the world on these issues, and that has really helped. Next slide, please. The 5th lesson is that we need to look at women as consumers, producers, innovators, and not just beneficiaries. And this is not just sexual and reproductive health, but any field, that there tends to be a lot of rhetoric about women's rights, but many programs and policies still function in terms of providing women a benefit, which feels like a favor rather than an entitlement. Excuse me. So it's important to focus on addressing women's needs, constraints, and barriers, but less often do we focus on their preferences, convenience, lifestyle, and aspiration. We tend to provide them what's serviceable rather than what is excellent. And a good example is, very limited contraceptive offerings, which means, well, here are the 2 things you can do, whereas a fuller menu would really help. Similarly, we go for giving women microcredit, but we give the rest of the world credit. So I think it is really important to think about excellence and women's choices, not just their needs. Women are the largest producers of health, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, but attention to their success, compensation, dignity, reward, leadership in that role is only emerging. And that is something that is very critical, not just to fixing health systems, but also obviously providing better health care and outcomes. And finally, women are unrecognized as innovators in solving the most pressing sexual and reproductive health and rights challenges. They're least involved in biomedical developments, conducting clinical trials, shaping digital technology solutions, or advising new governance and financing models. Feminist activists have struggled to influence these spaces. And for the climate change work, I think it's really important to have women be engaged in solving the problem as serious leaders and innovators. Next slide. That's all I have to say, and thank you very much, and I look forward to a very exciting and interesting discussion.
Welcome, everyone. Once again, I'm Joanna Riha, a research fellow here at the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health. And thank you, Anju, so much for that presentation. I think as we move into the panel discussion, there is so much that we'd like to pick up and hear from our phenomenal experts who are joining us today. There are 3, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. The first is Ms. Sivananthi Tinandaran, who's the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, based here in Malaysia. We also have Mr. Rajib Ghoshal, who's the Senior Regional Technical Advisor on Climate Change for Save the Children International's regional office in the Asia Pacific region. And finally, Dr. Eric Zussman, who's the Senior Policy Researcher and Area Lead at the Institute for Global Environmental Studies. So welcome, everyone. An absolute pleasure and honor to have you here. You bring such a wealth of experience. I mean, I haven't read your bios to everyone in detail, but please, do look them up. A vast amount of experience, both in the space of sexual and reproductive health, as well as climate change. And as we are about to kick off the conversation, actually, at one point to note, we do have apologies from Dr. Carla Berdichevsky, who unfortunately cannot make the panel today. But I think we have a fantastic lineup, so I won't stop here. I wanted to kick off actually and ask, and this is very much a conversation style, so I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly with regards to one of the points that Anju raised in her presentation, in terms of the imbalance with regards to interventions in sexual and reproductive health that tended to focus more on individuals and communities as opposed to health systems. And I wondered if each of you could tell us a little bit about what could be done to prevent such an imbalance from the perspective of climate change and gender integration into climate change programs. So Siva, if I can start off by asking you.
Yeah, thank you, Johanna. I feel like, this is like, for me, a sort of a chicken and egg type of question, right? Because we talk about, programs that have been primarily focused on individuals and communities. But, I feel like very often, this work that we are doing at the individual and community level, I mean, the aim of that data, the aim of that learning is actually to reflect back, right? In order to reorient policies and programs and redesign systems to make those systems serve marginalized and vulnerable populations better. But how do I say that? Linking that learning from the community and individual level and bringing it upwards or scaling it up to system-wide change is this huge gap that we've always been experiencing. And then also, we also need to think like, how often have we actually, redesigned the system? Because I do remember since the time of the inception of the SDGs, we've been talking about to help serve those underserved, right, or those left behind. And yet we saw in the pandemic that not enough adequate measures within the system were put in place, that even in the health system, those who are vulnerable and marginalized are the ones who actually bore the brunt of the pandemic itself, right? So I think that this health system change is something that we really need to think greatly about. And COVID-19 has already showed us and continues to show us how large-scale events disrupt not only health services but all social services, right? And we can use the word, I think, health system like so loosely, but it actually covers so many layers, right? And what we call the health system is made up of so many different components, whether they are at the highest level, the budgets and priorities, then there are also the facilities, which can be at primary level, tertiary level. There are health personnel, which are specialists, administrators, but also cover, ordinary doctors, nurses, paramedics, volunteers. I mean, in a number of developing countries, family planning services are actually carried out by lady health workers, or who are all volunteering their time, right? And administrative cleaning staff. I mean, so these are all the personnel that make this health system function. So at each level, we can see that the challenges that climate change poses on the system are different, but each one is as disruptive as the other. For me, I've always felt, and I'm not alone in thinking this, that with COVID, we saw that disruption, right, that happened at societal level. And we are still living through the pandemic and we haven't recovered. In 2 years, we haven't even been able to, I think, learn a lot more about how to re-engineer our systems to serve the underserved populations better. But we can see that, the tendencies of governments to regard the problem as a short term, right, not a medium term or long term, has driven the way in which investments, interventions were rolled out, right? and the use of this crisis terminology. So not only the pandemic was a crisis, but even climate change, right? We talk about it as a climate crisis. To describe what we go through, is not helpful, because a crisis talks about emphasis on short-term measures. So they talk about building shelters for those affected by climate change, rolling out aid, finding the housing, clothing, food, but not necessarily or not adequately providing for resettlement, right? If their houses are permanently destroyed or lost, or skills, training, and capital to set up new lives. So it's just not about allocating funds for relief work, and whether it's intersectoral between ministries of health and environment and gender. But this changes the way in which even line ministries and bureaucratic hierarchies work within the system. So these are some of those ways in which knowledge can be adequately shared in order to be able to set priorities. And I think that we know so much about what happens during floods, because so many countries in our region have been affected by it, right? So whether health facilities get flooded, experience electricity cuts, equipment gets spoiled, patients, especially those who are bedridden, cannot be moved quickly enough. If flooded, the sanitary aspect cannot be guaranteed for patients whose immunity is compromised in some way. Electricity cuts, in health facilities, access to generators, where medicines, blood supplies, OT facilities, the schedule is interrupted, right? So access to the facilities are also hindered when, roads are destroyed. So we have to look at, and personnel, you may have some who are more severely affected than others, but they're not only accessing or reaching their place of work. So they may not be fully resourced in order to, turn up at work during a crisis period, right? So we need to really look at, research not only into systems and how communities interact with each other, but to learn from other crisis situations and what works well in that, and see how it can be related to what will happen to rolling out health services during climate change. And of course, I think that's sort of like a management type of research question. Also, it's like about how new ways of working together. How do ministries sit together to make intersectoral policy making? How do they roll out programs together? And then looking at, who are the communities? Because every community in every country, there will be different communities, and those communities are not only poor and living in climate vulnerable areas, but they may have these other, intersectional vulnerabilities, which could be perhaps they are indigenous populations, maybe they're stateless, maybe they are from migrant, undocumented migrant communities working in those particular areas of work. So these are some of those questions we need to look at to really, have a hard look at who are the communities in our countries that we're trying to serve, and and how can we actually reorientate the health system to serve people in this time of climate change.
Thank you so much, Siva. Rajib, can I turn over to you and hear your thoughts and reactions, I guess, also in terms of what Siva has said, perhaps?
Actually, thank you so much, Johanna, and thanks to everybody. It was so wonderful and a privilege to hear everyone, including Siva, Dr. Mohammed, and Anju. And it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here. Actually, most of what I'm going to say has already been said. My only take is I'll give you a few reality checks in terms of how much work is being done in climate change and health. For example, if you look at all the climate finance mechanisms who are operating in the world, there are about 30 plus climate finance mechanisms. If you count, large number of them do not actually address the intersections between climate change and health considerations. In fact, a very small amount of the portfolio is dedicated to climate change and health. Having said that, if we look at how climate change and non-climate change drivers form an unholy alliance to actually result in marginalization, weak political, social institutions, environmental stress, fragility, social inequities, and then erosion of social cohesion. and which in turn leads to, in a very interconnected manner, and this is where that holistic approach, which, if I recall, Anju was talking about, leads in turn to multidimensional poverty, weak health services and systems, limited access to diversified livelihoods, forced migration and displacement, which in turn leads to increased vulnerability of women and children, and in many cases, violence against them in any form or type, instability and conflict, poor educational outcomes, famines, and hunger. My take from all this, and from what I've heard from other panelists and presenters, is we need both a top-down and bottom-up approach. It's not easy to do. We need to shift the paradigm in terms of understanding how we can replicate, scale our projects which deal or address climate change and health in a manner where you're not only talking to systems improvement, but also addressing aspects which lead to improving knowledge of communities and capacitating them to actually address some of the health hazards which result from climate change variability and extreme weather events. It's not either one or the other approach. It has to be both. But to have that, you need governments to weigh in. You need large climate finance mechanisms to weigh in. For example, what Siva talked about and Anju mentioned in terms of COVID, it's a classic example of a systems failure in terms of critical care, in terms of how an environmentally driven zoonotic disease actually played havoc and created a shadow pandemic for a number of women and children across the globe. So much so that it nearly quadrupled the number of domestic violence across the world and created a number of mental and physical health issues, which you all know about. It's tragic because most of the funds for what I believe is the missing link between short to medium term vulnerabilities and long term resilience of communities, including women, adolescent girls, children, both girls and boys, and youth, is about shock responsive social protection. And we don't have a large number of those programs happening in the developing countries as opposed to the developed countries, at least during the pandemic and post COVID, if you want to call it a post COVID situation, even though we are still in a COVID situation. From the billions of money which went into social protection, large number of it actually went into developed countries and not vice versa into developing countries. Now, for me, the biggest lesson I learned, and I'll be very brief on this, is if you want to look at classic great examples of how shock responsive social protection has worked in terms of skilled birth attendance, in terms of education improvements, in terms of ending early marriage and forced unions, although I do not have the evidence right in front of me in terms of preventing intimate partner violence, all you need to do is go back to the 1990s and look at the Latin American countries in terms of how they actually established social safety net mechanisms and through which they scaled their government projects or programs which dealt with issues related to gender-based violence, early marriage outcomes, and so on and so forth. For example, Bolsa Familia, Bolsa Escola, Mexico's Oportunidades program, Colombia's conditional cash transfers, and the likes. There's a huge amount of evidence how this can play a huge, if you like, intervention in terms of addressing both systems-based improvements and bottom-up approaches to community-driven health interventions. Thank you.
I am going to probe, if I can, Rajiv, briefly before I ask Eric. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to hear from you. In terms of your point with regards to climate finance mechanisms, taking an integrated perspective and including health, for example, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit in terms of your experience at the Green Climate Fund and integrating or mainstreaming gender from that perspective and what that meant or what that looked like from a funding, a climate finance mechanisms perspective.
Yeah, it's a bit more complex than that. Actually, I was the first gender and social specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And we made it mandatory for, when I was at the Green Climate Fund, we made it mandatory for entities including UN agencies, UNDP, UNEP, multilateral development banks, and others to come up with a gender and social assessment and gender and social inclusion action plan. Large chunk of those plans were addressing gender-based violence in different contexts, but not so much in the context of sexual and reproductive health rights or in terms of adolescent sexual and reproductive health rights. It is only recently that we might have a discourse or narrative happening at the Green Climate Fund, which I'm not fully aware of. But the person who succeeded me in as the gender and social specialist, she is delightfully militant about this entire issue of gender-based violence. And it has become a mainstay in any of the gender and social assessments and GESI action plans. Having said so, it is much more in terms of looking at it at the intersection of other sub-thematic areas like livelihoods, water security, food security, and the likes. But as Nanju and others have pointed out, we should not see these in compartments or silos, because in environmentally degraded ecosystems, a lot of women and girls who go and fetch water are prone to a lot of violence and abuse as they do so. And there is a lot of evidence from extreme weather events which tell us that, for example, in Vanuatu, gender-based violence went up by 300% after the two hurricanes which hit Vanuatu. So we need to look at it from a more holistic perspective and not from silos and in compartments where you look at sectors like, for example, water, food security, livelihoods, but have gender-based violence or gender equality as a cross-thematic area, which actually allows you to address such issues both from a top-down and a bottom-up approach.
Thank you, Rajiv. Eric, can I turn to you? Would you like to add or expand on some of these points?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna and Rajiv and Sivan and colleagues. So I'm coming at this from a political science perspective. That's my training, and that's where I started to explore some of the intersection between gender and climate issues. And in political science, and the framing that we often use to describe this dynamic between sort of more top-down and bottom-up is architecture and agency. We look at the institutional architectures and try to understand what are some of the opportunities for participation, engagement, influence, and then we also look at the agency of the different individuals, how they can participate, whether they have the capacities, the skills that are needed to change that architecture. And of course, the sort of outcomes come between sort of those interactions between the architectures and agencies. That's quite abstract, obviously, but I think it gives us a useful framing for thinking at how these dynamics can sort of play out in a way that would help us address climate change and some of its gendered impacts. And then I'd like to try to focus a little bit more on an example that shows how this architecture and agency can work together to change things for the better. And for that example, I want to turn to some work that we did a few years ago with the Asian Development Bank and partners from SNV. And in that project, we tried to develop a gender responsive approach to climate change mitigation. Now, I know we've had a lot of discussion already about the adaptation and resilience side of climate change, and I think that's wholly deserved and incredibly important, especially when we talk about health impacts. But the mitigation side is also important. A lot of times, because a lot of the finance for climate change, although this is balancing out a little bit, is still going to the mitigation side of things. And for this project, what we used was a multi-level perspective, once again, where we tried to focus not only at the community level, where we were trying to create more agency, but higher up at the city and national level and institutional level, where we're trying to create openings and structures to make sure that that things were moving in a transformative direction. And for this project, so what we did with this multi-level perspective is we had community-based projects. For instance, in Vietnam, we helped to set up biodigesters that were manufactured and led by women-led companies. And the biodigesters would, of course, mitigate climate change. They would help also raise climate change finance. And at the same time, they gave a tangible example of something that the city level policymakers could look to change their own institutional structures, so that in this case, the city was Dong Hoi in Vietnam, so that the Dong Hoi Women's Union could participate with the environmental agency in crafting the city's climate change policy. Similarly, in Lao PDR, we also created a series of pilot projects focusing on the cook stove issue. Obviously, this has big impacts on air quality, health, climate change. But then we also built a collaborative relationship between the Lao Women's Union and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, and helped to make sure that the Lao Women's Union would be part of the discussions over what was then called the intended nationally determined contribution, or INDC, and gradually would become the nationally determined contribution. This is the big national pledge of climate change actions that countries put forward. And so this multi-level approach really is focusing a lot, once again, on this agency and architecture dynamic, and really trying to change the institutions, the policies, and also give some tangible examples of projects, and do this in a mutually reinforcing way, so that you can open doors for bigger and more transformative changes. So I think this sort of highlights some of the dynamics that were suggested by others, and also puts interesting perspective on the question that Joanna originally raised. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I think those are fantastic examples, very concrete examples, also bringing out some of the points that Andrew raised, in particular to her sort of final lesson in terms of seeing women as innovators and contributing very actively to finding solutions, right? Beyond just beneficiaries. So I think those are fantastic examples. I wanted to move on to a question regarding measures of success. And Andrew really highlighted this as an issue in terms of a lack of a consolidated and sort of broad range of measures that exist in the SRHR space in particular, although within some subfields, there are more defined and smaller number of definitions of what success means or looks like. And I wondered if each of you could briefly share with us today what your thoughts are in terms of what success would look like from a gender equality perspective in terms of climate change programs. And would it be helpful to be aware of this need to perhaps limit and constrict the number of measures of success so that we can say more about the evidence that does exist? Yeah, I very much welcome your thoughts. Rajib, can I start with you? Sorry, you're on mute.
Thanks, Joanna. I somehow had an intuition you would put me on the spot on this, but it is, from a results management perspective, a lot easier and practical to start with a minimum level or minimum number of measures of success, particularly for issues related to, gender-based violence or violence against women, because it is very difficult or challenging to understand or know who the perpetrators are. And more often than not, women and girls don't speak out because of fear of perpetrators and lack of any legal systems or support systems to actually, help them to overcome the physical and mental agony of going through the process of abuse of any type. So what I would do is, but a lot of progress has been made over the last few years in terms of creating a database by, let's say, for example, World Bank has it. It has a live platform on intimate partner violence. ADB has it. UN Women has it. In fact, if you look at the latest IUCN and UN Women publication on gender-based violence, that's really, really great. There is an infographic on, very small, on key indicators on how many women have experienced gender-based violence, etc. So what I would do is come up with a very minimum level of, or rather, minimum set of measures of success that would talk to, for example, say X number of women who have experienced, violence of any type, etc. And I'm just saying this aloud, and not in any, sort of organized manner. And I would also look at number of, if you like, proxy indicators or proxy measures of success, which actually tell you how you can address the multiple causal pathways in a theory of change. So if you don't get into, say, for example, concrete measures of success which talk to you about women experiencing violence through intimate partners, then what you can do is say X number of women and adolescent girls who have increased agency, voice, and are meaningfully participating on issues of their choice, including SRHR and so on and so forth. What that does is it will give you a pathway to understand what you could possibly measure at the intermediate outcome level rather than at the highest level of the results chain. But of course, just one last point, Joanna, is we need to be very careful when we do this in terms of attribution and contribution. So when we employ measures of success at the lowest rung of the results chain, that should mean that you can provide indicators and measures of success or targets which you can easily hold your project program to accountable. You can hold your project accountable to, like for example, in terms of contribution. But at the highest stage, it will be a lot of other partners who would actually need to work with you in terms of attribution to that cause. So we need to distinguish between the two. Thank you.
Thank you so
Sorry
much, Rich. No, not at all. I wish we had more time. It's always the problem with the panel discussions. Siva, can I turn to you?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Johanna. And I listened very carefully to what Rajiv had said. So I think firstly, what would success look like? I think often climate change is framed as a technical issue. It's a science issue. And for us who have been going to the discussions from Rio to the COP, gender issues are very often sidelined. But climate change is just not a science issue. It's a people's issue. So I think the shifting and the framing of climate change being a people's issue would be like the first, I think, indicator of success. The second thing I wanted to say is that, women are adversely affected, right, due to existing gender power imbalances in society, community, and family. So there are three areas on which we can look at measures of success. One is, of course, that women and girls face the triple care burden. That is, the burden within the reproductive work, the productive work, and the work that is taken at the community level, all of which will be changing, right? The second area that we should have measures around is about, of course, challenges to our SRHR, whether it's early age marriage in climate vulnerable populations or sexual violence, as Rajiv has talked about, or how access to contraception and safe abortion could be limited depending on which community we belong to. And then, of course, the third area is actually loss of access to resources, because loss of livelihoods, assets, and resources, especially for women during the time of climate change, is very great and very real. This, in fact, then has an impact on the agency of women and girls within their families and within their communities in order to address the gender power imbalance that they already experience. So I think that these are the three areas we can actually look at, this making strong and concrete measures around, and then it'll make a difference.
Thanks so much, Siva. And Eric, can I turn to you to get your reflections? And actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you an additional question and then loop back around in terms of a takeaway as well, if you'd like to leave us with one takeaway after your thoughts on a measure of success.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine that question. I think my colleagues Rajiv and Siva have already done a nice job of defining some of the measures of success, but I want to talk very briefly about what we do with those measures once we have them in place. And one of the things that we've been working on I've been at this institute, the IGHS, for 15 years, so I've been working on this basically for 15 years, is thinking more and more not only about how we measure success, but how we recognize and reward success. And one of the things that's happening now in the climate change discussions under, we call Article 6, which will determine how climate finance is allocated, and also how market mechanisms work, is rewarding, I know we don't want to use this word benefits, but rewarding co-benefits. What I mean by that is making sure that when we have a climate finance project and it delivers significant benefits for women, we have good indicators to measure that, but we can also say that an additional amount of resources is allocated to incentivize investors to put money into that area because it's delivering additional benefits. So I think we need to get and we're working in that direction. I mean, there's opportunities within the Article 6 rulebook now to more systematically assess and measure these different types of benefits, and then to reward those different types of benefits. And for instance, the Asian Development Bank is putting out a tool in the next few months, which will help us look at some of these benefits for its climate finance projects. I know Rajiv used to work there in the past, and they're moving in a good direction. Of course, the Green Climate Fund, we also have already talked about that. And there's also the gold standard, which is a voluntary certification mechanism. So I think this alignment between the way we measure success with our climate finance mechanisms and the SDGs and some of the indicators that were mentioned by my colleagues, I think is a good thing. But just recognition is not enough, but rewarding and making sure that there's actual finance that incentivizes the uptake of that type of work, I think is also essential. So I'd like to see us move more in that direction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric, for that point. I think reminding us beyond measures, right? What to do next, and yeah, looking at rather than the stick, the carrot. Rajiv, if I can ask for 30 seconds, last minute takeaways or what you'd like to leave us with, and then I'll end with Siva.
Yeah, I'll just take off from where Eric and Siva talked to. I would just say from the top level, combine and interconnect the Agenda for Sustainable Development, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes gender equality, climate action, amongst other goals, look at the Paris Agreement, connect it with the Agenda for Sustainable Development, and most importantly, something which is of a stepchild in any climate change and disaster risk reduction and humanitarian response is look at the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which includes a heavy focus on social protection. For me, the takeaway is if you combine these frameworks and people work at the highest level on all these frameworks which came about in 2015, you will get a lot more interconnectedness in the way we approach these issues, including gender-based violence and everyone talked about here. And that is where we need to stop thinking about a project being a climate first project or a project being a development or a humanitarian project. Like the Secretary General recently said, a climate crisis is also a humanitarian crisis. That is where I leave it as such. And it's up to us how we play the game, because there is a lot of political issues also involved in terms of why people don't talk to each of the frameworks together. Thank you.
Siva, please. Last reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Johanna. I think Rajiv gave this really strong point. How do we plan to play this game? And I think that one is, we have to keep in mind that climate change is a deeply political issue, and we shouldn't shy away from tackling this as a political issue, right? Climate change is calling on us to understand and correct not only development models, but also inequalities in society, because we will find that the poorest communities live in the most climate vulnerable areas, right? Those who have contributed least to climate change, where those suffer the greatest damages of losses, of homes, whole cultures, and communities which are displaced and lost due to climate change. So we have to take and think of a radically different path. I know that it always looks like a very big thing that we have to handle when we talk about a radically different path, right? But it's also that's what climate change is calling us to do, and we have to be up to taking up that challenge. And we not only have to rethink the economic system, but also the deep divisions between the North and the South. And we saw this, right? Not only the technology transfer for climate change between the North and the South, it's very similar to the vaccine inequity issue between the North and the South. But also, we're talking about the story of colonialism and the exploitation of our environments for the enrichment of the global North. I saw amongst the questions that had come up, they said, what about climate refugees? And it's very interesting because there are very few, I don't think there's any human rights frameworks that actually talk about climate change as an agenda. So what standard are we going to hold, governments or, accountable to? Because those standards don't exist. So I feel like, we really, have to do justice to the next generation and to do justice to these vulnerable communities, that we really have to start today, to rethink and take up the challenge of redesigning the system.
Thank you so much, Siva. And thank you, Eric and Rajiv. I think it's been a phenomenal conversation. Like I said, I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we have hit the hour mark, a little bit over. So thank you so much once again for joining us. And I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation going, actually. So thank you. In terms of closing remarks, so we are out of time, and I'm going to bring the event to a close. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us across the world, no doubt. On behalf of everyone here at IIGH, thank you. And yes, please visit our website to see the work that we've been doing and keep up to speed. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Sorry, I assumed that Johanna had brought this to a close. I just want to say for 2 seconds, a very big thank you to our partners, UNICEF and Arrow, in this work, to all the presenters, a phenomenal job. This is one of the really nice things about CSW, that we bring practitioners and researchers and CSOs together, and it's wonderful. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.